Thank you for joining us, UNO alumni and friends. I'm really excited about today's virtual Meet Us At presentation. It's called Pivot Point, Insights into the Workplace Revolution. For today's Meet Us At, we're partnering with AOS and one of our board members, Alexis Moran, who has been so gracious to develop and join us today for this presentation, as well as her colleague, Sam, who is joining us all the way from Indianapolis. So thanks so much. This presentation is a collaboration between AOS and Doris Research, and it will shed light on how the COVID-19 pandemic has transformed the way we work today and how we'll need to adapt to work in future environments. The driver for this study was to gather qualitative and quantitative data intended to answer the most pressing questions on how we can prepare organizations and leaders for this unprecedented opportunity to rethink the fundamentals of the physical workspace. AOS Interior Environments workplace strategist and UNO alumnus, Alexis Moran, and the president and founder of Doris Research, Sam Hulka, will be leading this presentation. Okay, thank you again for joining us. And if you would like to ask any questions during the presentation, it's highly encouraged. Please use the chat function and we'll be breaking in and moderating questions as they arise. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you, Alexis and Sam.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you to UNO alumni and friends for having us today. Like Rachel said, please use the chat feature. We're gonna throw some questions out to the audience, but any follow-up questions, feel free to include in the chat, or we'll include our contact information at the end. Don't hesitate to reach out. As Rachel said, this presentation was developed, the Pivot Point, Insights into the Workplace Revolution. I want to start by sharing, we've all heard this term of workplace. What's the future of the office? You know, that's a question a lot of us have been pondering or asking or being tasked with. And, you know, my team is reading everything we can get our hands on to try and answer those questions. And I want to share this video that I think kind of sums up some of the thoughts that we have just to get us started. So I think this video perfectly encapsulates how change has been happening in the work environment throughout history. And that this, while COVID-19 is relatively, a new challenge that we're all faced with, changing and adapting to the way we're working isn't. And that, there has been this series of revolutions, and that time and time again, we're shown that the office is more than simply a location. It provides a place for people to collaborate, for them to create, innovate, execute. It's where clients get to know your organization, and it's where team members get to know one another. We've heard time and time again that it acts as this driver of culture. It's the physical definer of brands. And that, COVID-19 has just presented this pivot point for this spaces. So as Rachel said, we have teamed with Doris Research. I'm joined by Sam, the president and founder of Doris Research. She started her career as an interior designer before returning to get her MFA in design thinking and design research. She formed Doris Research, creating this workplace strategy organization that now works with clients all over the United States. I am Alexis Moran. I'm with AOS Interior Environments. I do business development for our construction team. And I have most recently ventured into the workplace strategy side, partnering with Sam. And we wanted to share this qualitative and quantitative response and information that really gave us some tangible content to start thinking about how we'll be moving forward. So Sam, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Alexis. Thanks so much. Perfect. Thanks for getting me on to my next one there. So I think that video I share excitement around that video with Alexis. And what's always fun for us to do when we have a group on a call like this is to sort of put ourselves in the change for a minute. And so if we look at this woman here in this image, and we start this entire research presentation on sort of pretending we are researchers in this moment and pretending that we are ethnographically studying this woman. We're going to observe her, and we're maybe going to write down what we think she's doing. If we were going to do that, I'm going to invite you, whoever's listening along here, to try to find the chat feature in this Zoom call and give me a couple words describing the woman in this picture. Tell me what she's doing. And don't be shy. Give us some ideas. Try to help us start to frame this talk via what you're thinking about in relationship to the image of this woman. Anything coming up in the chat, Alexis?
I don't see anything yet, but my own interpretation is that she might be concentrating or, working on a specific output.
Working hard. Yep. Okay. Yep. Working in an open environment, focused. Good. Looks like some sort of blueprint. Yeah. Yep. Good. Okay. Very good. Focused. Planning something. Distracted by others talking. Yeah. Good. Okay. So, let's see. We're going to flip onto one more. We're going to just play along with me here, friends. We're going to do it one more time with this next image. Click it forward. There we go. Okay, so this is a picture we took in our office here in Indianapolis before COVID hit. So this is pre-pandemic. We're not super spreading, but if you had to describe what we're doing here in a couple of words, what would you say? And again, throw it in the chat. Tell me what we're doing. Brainstorming. Yep. Collaborating. Yep. Very good. Anyone see anything else? Teamwork. Okay, so excellent work, team. The brainstorming, collaborating, and teamwork are generally the three most common words. I've given this talk that we're about to get into here probably 100 times at this point, and this is what we always hear for this image. And we generally hear something like she's concentrating or she's focusing in the first image. And so what's so interesting to us is that when we look at her, we don't immediately think that she's doing anything collaborative or in anything that's teamwork related. And so if you sort of think about yourself, maybe over the last 12 months or so, it's possible that in the moments in time when you were collaborating or working on a team with a team on something, if you took a picture from the side of you, you might look more like her than you would look like this second image. And going back to the video that we watched in the beginning, things are changing kind of rapidly and quickly here. And we're changing how we do the work that we do day to day. We're even changing the way it might look. So, when we started in that video and people were working I think in the 1800s, it looked very different, right, than how we're working in the 21st century. So it's very fascinating how quickly it's changing now over the last 12 months, how things have changed. So we'll kind of keep
And
that in mind. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no, and just how our perceptions of that change are not really catching up, and that it's really this challenge to look at how we're working differently.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, so where we started on this particular research project that we're gonna talk through here in a second was with just the general concept of productivity. So we really wanted to understand and figure out, what did productivity mean as folks were migrating to maybe working more independently in a remote setting? We're trying to really get our heads wrapped around how people were defining that and what it meant. So we started the study there. But as we began studying, we knew that we needed to add a few other components into this study. So we were ultimately looking at collaboration, creativity, innovation, strategy, and productivity related to people working in a remote setting versus an in-person setting. So this is the lenses through which we were focusing our research qualitatively and quantitatively. We'll kind of talk about how we did that on the next few slides here. So we engaged organizations in several different verticals. There were actually 16 organizations that were participating in this study. And this pie chart on the right here is looking at how our participants were distributed from a status standpoint. So think about folks in this study, about a third of them were working in some kind of hybrid model, about a third were working fully remote or from home, and about a third were working fully in the office, which was very convenient for us because we were able to look through each of these lenses as we were gathering information in our 5 areas. So this slide is helping us better understand the population of the people that participated in our study. So we had 16 organizations and we had 5 participants from each organization. We had each organization provide us with somebody at the leadership level, some individual contributors, and some folks in management, maybe say middle management. The age of the folks in this study were very representative of any workforce slice that we would take today. In fact, age didn't really become a very interesting demographic as we started to look at the data that we were bringing in. And the organizations, I should say, ranged in size from, let's say, 25 employees to well over 12,000. So think like small local organizations to large multinational global organizations participated. So we conducted this study over a period of 6 weeks that started in September of 2020. So we were in 4th quarter of 2020, moving from September to October. There were 81 participants in the study. We worked to align all the participants in the study to make sure that they understood what we were after and what we were looking for. 77 of them went through a very qualitative interview. So we engaged them to very deeply understand what work was like for them. So this wasn't a survey. This is our research team very closely engaging each of these participants. And then quantitatively, our statistician had each of the participants come through a training session where they learned how to quantifiably capture for us collaborative encounters they were having. So they all downloaded an app on their smart device, and for 2 business days, every time they would have a collaborative encounter, they would log it for us, and they would tell us what the nature of that collaborative encounter was. So we would know things like, what were they talking about, or what was the encounter regarding, how long did it take, what devices were they using, how effective was it? We had all kinds of data surrounding these encounters. And we ended with a meeting with all of the participants. Okay, so now we'll get into the results. What did we find? So when we brought the data back in-house, we realized that there was very quickly a system forming from those 5 components that we were studying. And when we better understood how the participants in our study described innovation and creativity, it sort of sat at the base of our system. And our research team labeled these as fundamentals. So people were describing creativity and innovation as things that were fundamental to their organization, sort of like the bedrock their organization sat on. When they talked about collaboration and strategy, they talked about it as something that was generative. So it was sort of to be thought of as the things that enabled something else to happen. And then when they talked about productivity, they talked about it as a driver. So something that moved the organization forward, sort of think day to day. And the pyramid works very much like bottom up. So think about like things are driven from the bottom of this pyramid up through that top layer, and they don't necessarily pull back down. And I'm going to dig a little bit deeper here, even into this pyramid. So when we engage these people, it's important to remember that these are sort of everyday people who go to work. They're not people who actively are studying the concept of like business management or organization in any way. So they're your everyday, people who are just trying to get their job done. When they describe these components to us, they attached usually more human-centered words. And so we're trying to illustrate that here. So when they talked about creativity, a lot of times they would talk about the word energy. So they'd talk about it as like, when I'm being creative, really what I need is the energy from another human. That's what makes creativity happen. When they talked about innovation, they would often talk about the need for communication. They would talk about needing to engage diverse groups of people, communicate with diverse groups of people to innovate. Collaboration to me made a lot of sense. They would often use words like accessibility when describing how collaboration worked. When they talked about strategy, they would use words that were like purposeful, effortful. It was something that was intentional. And then this one to us was maybe the most interesting. So when they talked about productivity, they were talking about, and they would describe their own individual responsibilities. So think like the things that an individual has to check off their list and get done each day. That's how people sort of at the individual level are describing productivity. And what we noticed here that was really interesting was there was sort of a nuance in the way the language was coded that was coming out of the word productivity. So most people were describing it in that way, individual basis. And we started to label that little p productivity at the individual level. But there was also a smaller contingent of people who were talking about productivity, but more from the organizational level. So when they described productivity, it wasn't individual responsibility. It was like the organization as a whole. And so we started labeling that big P productivity, and big P productivity could encompass perhaps the entire pyramid or other factors. But what was interesting was that how there was one word that was being used by, let's say, two stakeholder groups to describe two very different things. And then, there could be some challenges with that. Okay, so I'm going to move on here into looking a little bit deeper at what we found from each of these components. And we're going to start just with this efficacy graph. So we asked the participants to help us understand how well were each of these components performing on a scale from 0 being performing very poorly to 10 being performing very well. And we were looking at how are they performing in the past, let's say before COVID, in the present, let's say during COVID, and then in the future, sometime when we've maybe been able to effectively move beyond COVID, whatever that might look like. So two lines that are really interesting to us as the research team would be this teal line and the orange line. And so I'm going to start with the teal line. Teal represents collaboration, and it's the component that has taken arguably the largest fall from grace here. So it's really decreased in the perspective of everyday workers. They don't believe that currently they're able to collaborate as well. And interestingly, this line kind of stops right behind this gray line here, the dot, it exists, and it doesn't go up back to where they had it before. So think about those two images that we were looking at in the beginning that you all were labeling. They kind of see collaboration still in this really nostalgic way, kind of like the second image that you all immediately labeled as collaboration. So people are sort of thinking of it as, and they're not sure in the future if we're ever going to be going back to something just like that. So folks that maybe have some kind of agency to steward the workforce or the workplace, starting to think about how are we going to enable our workforce to collaborate better and better moving into the future will be really important. The other line that's interesting is this orange line. This is innovation. It's the only increasing trend on the graph, meaning it's higher in the present than it was in the past. And what's interesting about this is that it's not that people think that they're being more innovative, let's say related to product or service within their organization, but they're talking about innovating on the way in which they do their job. So think like, I can now get on a Zoom call and I can do Teams and I can Slack my colleagues and I can store files on the internet or whatever it might be People believe that that has been their own level of innovation within their job. What's interesting, or maybe even the word exciting to us as researchers, is might we be able to capitalize on that momentum at this moment in time? Can we continue to introduce new ideas? Can we push people to continue to change? Do we have a little bit of time where maybe change is a little more fluid for us, where we can be really innovative and continue that trajectory north?
I think another thing is, how do the two lines work together? How can we lean on our innovation and the increase in innovation to promote more collaboration in the future?
Absolutely. For sure. All right, so we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive here into each of the components. So I'm going to start with creativity. And as a reminder, creativity was sitting at the bottom of our pyramid as that foundational level, bedrock of business, right? Or an organization. When we looked at quantitatively how people were convening, even during the pandemic, for certain types of collaborative encounters, we were so surprised when we saw how large of quantities were gathering for something in the name of creativity or something strategic in nature. And we were so surprised that we actually went back to make sure that we didn't have a reporting error in this data. But it was correct. We have multiple occasions where people were convening in large groups for these two particular types of collaborative encounters. So to us, this seems like a really important long view, or maybe not even that long of a view. So think about what will start to draw people back into the workplace. It will likely be things like an endeavor based in creativity or something that's strategic in nature again. So those will be ways in which people will probably want to start to venture back in. They might continue, maybe even long-term, to work on things that are maybe more project related or task oriented from home. Like those things might be things that continue to happen that way. So if we start to think about the future of the workplace, it will probably be heavily focused on supporting creative endeavors, strategic endeavors, and other activities that look like that.
That's one question just coming from the design industry that we're asking clients is, how are you building space to be creative? How are you looking at space to capitalize on the creativity? This is one quote pulled directly from the data that really spoke to my team. And that's, creativity is thinking about things differently than we have in the past, looking at things from a different lens. And it really does require that energy, that group mentality of brainstorming or thinking outside of my typical lane going forward.
It's such an interesting exercise just to even ask your colleagues these simple questions. How do you define creativity? And think about what they would say. Like this is just an everyday person trying to describe it to us here. And you can see how they're really talking about, it's looking at things differently, thinking about engaging their colleagues in different ways.
Another point that this was really powerful for me, that seeing people in only 2 dimensions doesn't necessarily make for the most nuanced relationship building. It is hard to discern meaning. You lack the energy you get by being in the same room and sharing ideas and emotions. And I like to think about what may be missing from that 3rd dimension and how can you build it into your virtual platforms. For us, we have a camera on policy for most, smaller meetings, making sure your audio is in place, and also remembering that there's some drivers that are completely out of our control, like your internet connectivity or any distractions that may be coming up. And what can an individual do to account for those 3rd dimensional elements, or how can you make sure that you are building in those moments, whether in the office or remotely, to capitalize on that relationship building?
All right, so we're going to move in this pyramid just one block to the left here. So we're in the base. We're still talking about sort of fundamental elements of an organization. We're talking about innovation here. And people often talked about innovation related to communication. This is an importance performance indicator. And what we're showing here is that this line, this darker blue line here that's sitting just above 8 is how important people believe it is for them to bring innovation to work each day. And then green is how well are they able to perform that task. And so we can see we have a little bit of a deficit in both situations. But at home, it's people indicate that it's harder. It's harder to bring innovation to work when we're remote or when we're working from home.
One thing that I think perfectly captures some thoughts that I've had is that necessity is the mother of invention. We're all learning to work differently. And I would like to say that this participant put in parentheses after it, because we have to, is that overnight we were asked to make drastic changes. Individuals who had not ever used a digital platform are now working with it every single day, and just how much innovation has been infused in the past year. For example, I sit on a board that we have a executive call every single week that we used to literally three-way one another into, which there's 4 participants. And so now we use Teams. It just seems so silly that we'd done it any other way before that. And so just that, again, the mother of innovation. And as Sam mentioned, looking at the future, how can we keep infusing that innovation going forward to benefit the way we work?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few more thoughts here on innovation. Innovation, we do know from this study, is heavily supported by technology. So, right now people are understanding, just like Alexis talked about, that we are continuing to change based on the technologies that we're strengthening our muscles around. Like Teams probably existed to some degree before, they just hadn't sort of been forced into using it. Where all voices are heard. So this is really important. People understand that in order to innovate, we need to have diverse perspectives. They know that it's closely related to creativity. Sometimes they have a hard time separating the two. But
one
again,
thing that I'd like to point out with that is that, we can certainly, I think this could be seen as a positive in the virtual space, is that you can invite more people. There is a way that more voices are heard. There's certainly been dialogue about the equity that virtual learning has brought in the higher education space, but that the other side of this coin is that it can be challenging for those that rely on lip reading, those that are differently able, don't speak English as a first language, and just making sure teams are aware of that duality of like the benefit of more individuals, but then some individuals needing more support as well.
Yeah, completely. So there are benefits and challenges, just like Alexis talked about. One area that folks in this particular study saw as a deficit or something that became more difficult was that cross-team or interdepartmental engagement. So think like your water cooler moments. They were missing those from happening. I'm imagining many of us can think about situations that we used to have in the past where we would hit somebody up that wasn't maybe on our team. All right, so we're going to move now into this middle layer of the pyramid. So we're in strategy. And again, people talked about strategy being related to effort. A lot of purpose was involved. This graph is showing us the distribution of strategic encounters, whether they are impromptu or scheduled, across different job levels. So middle management is actually taking on more of the strategic encounters that occur than their counterparts above or below them. So these folks at the leadership level and the individual contributor level are not necessarily having their moments anymore. They're not, like, let's say, having those water cooler moments where they bump into each other. And we're really relying on this middle management group to facilitate connections between these two. This group's starting to feel a little overburdened, and I think we'll talk about that in a second.
Strategy is a plan. That's the more simple way to put it. It's just planning to create the outcome you're looking for. And as I mentioned with that, filling in for the third dimension is that if you're having these strategic meetings, what are the expectations for preparation? If you're not having these meetings in person, how can you utilize tools that the space may be providing for you? And I think one really important thing that stood out to my team was just how much a physical space does the work for you, and how much are the participants, and especially those middle managers, having to pick up for those gaps. And that when working from home, a space designed for personal comfort, there is an amount of management that is no longer facilitated by the space itself. So I think from home, there is this element of autonomy, again, given that there is not a number of distractions because you're homeschooling 3 kids or how our circumstances have changed, but that you do have the autonomy to work from home and create that personal comfort. From our team, we actually found some individuals felt that with screen time, they could be a little bit more vulnerable or more open or speak up in a way that maybe they wouldn't in person. But on the same side, the other side of the same coin is that there were some individuals who felt that they could hide behind the screen. And so that, making sure that facilitator is calling on those individuals and making sure everyone can speak accordingly.
Absolutely. So a few follow-ups here on strategy. What we did note is that strategic encounters are generally scheduled. So while we did capture impromptu encounters that were strategic in nature, they're most often scheduled. Again, this is something that people talked about being very intentional, requiring a lot of effort, very purposeful, and especially when they're not in the office together. It requires people that, like Alexa said, you have to be visible, you have to be able to see each other to do a very good job when you're doing something strategic. And then we started to hint at this here in the last few slides. Roles and responsibilities are becoming a little bit less clear when working remotely, especially when we're talking about something strategic. So that middle management group is really where the spotlight is being shown. They're the group that is feeling, let's say, most burdened with being able to figure out how to continue to operate. And so they might be having an increased number of strategic encounters. And if we are, let's say we have resources within our organization to deploy from
Training standpoint,
a training standpoint, professional development, that was what I was looking for, professional development standpoint, they might be a group that would really value having some attention paid to them on how to manage in a remote setting. Okay, so we're going to talk about impromptu encounters, and we want to know what you guys think. We're just ask if you'd use the chat again for a second. So thinking about when you would be in the office, and some of you maybe haven't been in, but where do impromptu encounters occur when you are there? Thinking back to that, or if you are going in, where do they occur?
A colleague of mine loves to say the ladies' restroom. Mm-hmm. She thinks that is her most collaborative impromptu space.
Hallway,
we see water cooler, office doorways.
Yes. We had an entire project where we were tracking where people were having collaborative impromptu encounters, and we were doing a heat map, and they were all around office doorways. This office had very few little meeting rooms, and we were like, well, you can either add more doorways or add more meeting rooms. Yeah, excellent. Okay, I think we have one more question. How do impromptu encounters occur in the office? So think about, again, when you would be in the office, or if you are in there now, how does this happen?
For me, I sit in an open office. So a lot of times it's overhearing what other people are saying. That makes me jump in or maybe ask a question shortly after.
Yep. So other ways that we captured in this study, good. Oh, side talks after meetings. Yes, Carl. Someone has a specific question to ask. Yes, you go seek someone out. Yep. Side talks after meetings. So that was recorded a ton in this study, the pre-meeting meeting, the post-meeting meeting. Yes, turning around in your chair, asking your question, or popping into someone's office. That was recorded too, quite a bit. So what's interesting to us from an impromptu encounter quantitative side of things. So in the office world, when we're all together, they're happening when we collected them happening. It sort of just was validating. They're happening in all the same ways we would expect, just like you guys are kind of talking about here. But what was interesting was that the participants didn't really believe they were happening in a virtual world, but they were actually logging them happening. And so what we were finding from the quantitative data collection on impromptu encounters was that they were happening in all sorts of different types of channels of communication. So they might start in an email or instant message and then elevate to a phone call and escalate into a web conference. And so you're kind of moving around these different communication channels as you're having an impromptu encounter occur. Oh, did I do that, Alexis?
Oh, I might have. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. What was interesting though, is when we compared scheduled collaborative encounters, this kind of candy apple green color that's the majority of the pie chart here, this is web conference. So when we're doing something that's scheduled, we are doing it like this, like we're doing right now. We're spending tons of time here. We're not spending as much time. Alexis kind of started out talking about her committee work or her board work, where they were doing a 3-way phone call or a 4-way phone call. Nowadays, we'd be like, well, why would you do that? Like, why wouldn't somebody just set up a Zoom call and like, you guys could log in? Like, and it's just, we've really changed very, very quickly into operating in a different way. We've also sort of changed the power dynamic when we think about the virtual world versus the in-person. So Alexis was talking about, just someone asking her a question sitting in the open office, I think. And that, when we're in person, the person with the question kind of has all the power. They can go interrupt sort of whenever they want. But when we're virtual, if you have a question, you're sort of at the mercy of the person with the answer to wait and get back to you. So depending on if you're a person with a lot of questions or a lot of answers, you might like one environment over the other better.
I think one important thing to point out here too is that I feel like this data point is so important with onboarding because of those like preset standards, right? So like my boss will take calls after 9 p.m. if we haven't been able to connect all day. And she never expects me to answer a call at 9 p.m., but she kind of has this unwritten rule that she's available. And that's exactly the challenge, is that it's unwritten. I only know that about her because I've been working with her for a while. So how are you setting those boundaries appropriate? How are you communicating the style of impromptu or scheduled meeting, how and when that's appropriate? And it's kind of been in flux in that I think this is a real challenge and opportunity for process and procedures going forward.
Absolutely. Yep. Completely agree. All right. Another slide here on collaboration. And this slide is so interesting to me. So what we were doing here is asking 2 questions with one having just a variation on the other. So we asked people to rate their importance level related to being able to have a collaborative encounter with someone else. And it's pretty important to them. It sits just under a 9 here. And you can see that they believe it works a little better in the office. The deficit in the office isn't as much as when it's at home. But when we add sort of one word into this question, we ask them about their ability to have impromptu collaborative encounters. Here you can see they don't see it as important. So it's an entire point down. It's just sitting now just under an 8. But what's interesting is when they're in the office, they believe it's performing just fine. And they do see it still underperforming at home. So we do need to figure out this impromptu situation.
One important takeaway was that collaboration is not a finish, not a complete task. It's not something that has an end, which can be a challenge for those scheduled meetings if there's not an actual end to this level of collaboration. It's intentional for the most part, but it's ongoing in pursuit of improvement. That's collaboration. And that, I think, sorry, Sam, love this slide. This is my favorite. This and the subsequent data pulls here is just that, for me, I was getting really frustrated with the productivity being used to define all the work that we're doing. And obviously we were hearing, some individuals saying they're more productive at home. But for me, I observe like a 0 inbox policy. Happy to answer any questions about that after. But that, once my inbox got to 0, where am I going from there? And that I think this is really important, that the collaboration and the tasks, while sometimes we feel that push and pull of it competing with productivity, that they're actually feeding one another. They really have this symbiotic relationship, that it's all working together. And how are we balancing it? Going back to what Sam had mentioned about the little p productivity and the big P productivity. And that's really up to leadership to make sure that that's being defined by all 3 of these working styles.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think this is kind of fascinating here. And thinking about just what we're illustrating here is that, people sort of see maybe collaboration as taking away from things that might be, productive in nature, but these things have to occur to feed into productivity eventually. And so if you don't have all of them, you will miss out on part of them.
A participant responded perfectly by saying productivity is being able to get in and focus on work and projects. Being able to focus on these tasks are processes that move our business forward. And again, how are we making sure that our productivity is moving the business in the right direction and that we're on the same page and that expectations are clearly communicated?
So a few notes here to round out productivity. So it increases at home because there is more time to do that heads down focused work, but there are trade-offs. So impromptu collaboration specifically, people see it as, let's say, distracting, and therefore, when they're at home, they can maybe increase their productivity, but their impromptu collaborative encounters, we know from the data, are going to be down. At home, there's less interruptions. Some people like that their availability is limited. They also like sort of that independent creative thinking time, especially if they are somebody who you might label as like creative, think like a designer. This is an area where they sort of are able to foster those new ideas. Okay, so getting into the summary. What did we learn? So just as a review, here's this pyramid again. Remember, creativity and innovation sit at the bottom fundamentally. Collaboration, strategy, more generative, and productivity is that driver when we're thinking about it in the little p setting at the individual level. And the pyramid works from the bottom up. So we're going to walk you through a few scenarios, and Alexis and I are going to kind of tag team through talking about these.
So this one and these scenarios are all considering that we are post-COVID. I like to point that out. But this one being just scenario one, within the office only. And that we can skip to the next slide.
So when we're in the office only, there are certain elements that the physical space itself can sort of help us with as humans. So if we look at these bars on this efficacy graph again, if a bar isn't touching the top level, it just means that we need to apply some human effort to get it there. So if there was a scenario in which every single person was coming back into an office, the first four are a little bit easier for us as humans to execute really well. So think about if we're going to have a creative encounter, creative meeting to some degree, it's easy for us to get that energy that we need from each other. We see each other, we understand, we can read facial expressions, we can continue to push our meeting forward, we can hop into a conference room quickly and hit a whiteboard. So the physical space kind of allows us to have some of that happen. Productivity is the one that's decreased the most in the scenario one, office only. And it doesn't mean that we can't be productive here. It just means we have to apply more human effort here. So especially when we talk about, like Alexis talking about sitting in an open office and someone coming by and asking her a question, she would need to put more controls and boundaries on the ability for her colleague to do that, and do something to help to push her efficacy level higher when trying to be productive at that little p level, individual level.
And then I think a recap of just, like I said, there's pros and cons to both, but that the benefits being that, strategy takes a little less work. Being together can create this energy or synergy, and that everyone is accessible for collaboration. So there is that element of, the doorway talk or the hallway or the kitchen talk, and everyone is there at the same time. So you don't have to worry about, Sam is only in on Wednesdays, so I need to ask her that question then. Whereas the challenges, like Sam mentioned, productivity can take a hit, and that innovation and culture need to be well communicated to make sure everyone's on the same page, that the bus is going, everyone's on the train going in the same direction. Yep. And then scenario two being everyone working from home. So again, at kind of that even playing field, but all virtually.
So when we look at our data here on this one, it really just looks like we kind of flipped the graph upside down from the in-person model. And it doesn't mean that this is a bad model. It just, when these bars are lower, again, it just means human effort has to be applied to be really effective. So when we think about, let's say, a creative endeavor in a virtual world, we're two-dimensional, so we can't pull the energy from each other as well now. Maybe we need to do something analog. We have to mail materials out ahead of time, or look for common things that we might have around. You're not supported with the space as much here. So the first 4 are a little bit lower on this graph. It doesn't mean we can't do them. It just means we have to apply more effort. Whereas productivity can be very effective when we're in sort of that silo at home. This is assuming, again, that you have the proper setup at home, that you're not remote learning 15 children at once, and you don't have a partner that's on a phone call all the time while you're trying to work, and also that you have really an at-home setup that's appropriate to actually do the work that you need to do at. But if you can line all those things up, you probably have the ability, based on the environment, to be more effective without too much effort.
Benefits here, again, everyone's on the same page because the expectation is the same across the board. Productivity can be maximized. Again, I think the dichotomy between the big P and the little p at play here. And everyone has focused time to work on individual tasks, some of that creative time, or you have autonomy over your time and how you're executing. Whereas the challenges, more effort might be needed to find a schedule. I don't know about all of you, but sometimes looking at my colleagues' calendars makes me very anxious because everything is being scheduled, and that can be a real challenge, and making sure you have the tools in place to do that. Creativity and innovation will require extra time and intentionality. We talked a little bit about that prep work that might be required, or those expectations before the meeting. Or maybe that homework that needs to be done in advance. And then structures and policies and expectations need to be in place. A clear remote policy, how is output being monitored, things of that nature. And the third scenario being hybrid, where there is a mixture of those working both remotely or from the office.
Yep. So this is the scenario that from a data standpoint looks kind of ugly on paper, but it's likely the scenario that most organizations are going to be going to in the future. So just as a reminder, when these bars are low, it doesn't mean they're bad. It just means that we need to think about how we're going to effectively execute each of these areas. So in the hybrid model, what happens here is Alexis talked about a level playing field. Here we're dismantling that. So now we have some people in, some people out. And if we're not careful and we don't have the correct discipline, we're going to face challenges. So it's possible out of the gate, we're going to have organizations that might stumble. So if you think about, let's say, doing something in the name of creativity, again, this one's always so easy to talk about. If we have 2 people in the office and 1 person at home, can the 2 people in the office jump into a conference room and bring a laptop in and point it at a whiteboard? And what if the camera can't read it? What if they can't hear them? There's so many variables to think about. What if they want to have that meeting after the meeting that we talked about? Do they have to call the person at home? Do they call them on a phone? Do they call them on a web conference? So there's just a lot to think about in terms of how do we execute this. Productivity probably fares pretty well here. What will be great about this model is talent attraction and retention. This will be probably great long-term for culture building. I wouldn't expect these bars to be to really increase as we strengthen our muscle in this area. But this is really, we're adding another dimension in here. So, we all went home and we stayed level on that playing field. But now when we're doing some of this in and out, if we use that big little example that we've been talking about with productivity and we apply that here, if organizations don't figure out, let's say, their big H model for hybrid, and they just enable the agency of everyone to run a little H model, kind of however they want a hybrid, that's probably where they're going to run into some challenges. So starting to align on what the hybrid model looks like will be really important.
I think a space that's really glaring is the conference rooms. Are you set up for video for everyone to be seen? How is the audio set up? How is the lighting? Can people take private calls? It's something that my office has been talking about a lot. But in this model, benefits being that everyone feels supportive through that flexible work environment. I think that the shutdown did humanize everyone in a way, because you're seeing their dog or hearing their kids. And so how can we capitalize on that? It can preserve that culture. It can really, again, employees feel seen and heard. It maintains productivity, which is, can be easier working from home. And then the flip side, just being that regular communication will be highly necessary, so everyone understands how it should work. I think expectations need to be very clear, especially that transparency with, when is Sam at home versus, because then do I need to do extra work if I'm in the office to have a remote meeting with her and maybe another participant? And then people need to understand when others are available, like I said, schedules, but also how can we collaborate together? And then there's dangers of misconception when people are working from different places. I think when we, as humans, naturally just fill in an answer when we don't know, and just making sure that that transparency and those policies and procedures are in place.
Yep. So Alexis is going to take us to the top takeaways.
Yeah, this kind of takes us through the end. So I wanted to just pause for a second and see if there were any questions or any ways in which, feel free to put them in the chat or pop them up as I'm going through our top takeaways I think one of the most important things is that collaboration is defined by the interviewees in the research as the act of working together to create tasks or progress towards a goal. This is easier to do in person because there's more organic opportunities for spontaneous collaboration. Again, just like we talked about, there's that doorway moment or the post-meeting moment that can facilitate that level of collaboration. And then some people feel as though they are more productive at home. This is likely because they have more control over their environment, resulting in fewer distractions and more focus. So I think this is also really powerful if we are moving to a hybrid model, is how can I support my individuals to find the space to build in their day like this and add that productivity while they may be at home, working from home.
Nope.
And then it can be easy to think about collaboration, creativity, innovation, strategy, and productivity as isolated factors. However, Doris has found that it's a much more complex system. Like we said with that one slide, it is all working together. All of the elements of the pyramid are working together. And I think it's really important to understand how your organization puts emphasis on those foundational driver and generative working styles. And then this is a part one of a series, part two being a toolkit that really helps define people, policy, trust. Those are the three drivers of this next step where, we can really help organizations define what is an appropriate model for them in coming back. Sam, was there anything you wanted to add?
It's really exciting. And this toolkit that will be available very soon, it will help organizations think about their hybrid model. And there's just, if we were going to add on that video in the beginning, it very quickly, in the next year or two, we'll be able to add such color to it and such interesting ways that we can watch how people are going to work, especially knowledge workers moving into the future.
Absolutely. And you want to answer the question?
Yeah. Did any of the companies interviewed already have a hybrid model in place pre-COVID, where employees could work from home a day or two per week, or even full time? Yeah, there were people who were working in a hybrid model, and some of them had been doing it before COVID. Yep.
What I think was really so important about the research was that it did that past view was very indicative of the way people might have been working from home or remotely.
Yeah. Good question. Any other questions we can answer about how we executed the work, or about the study?
feel free to pop them in there, or you can reach out to us. I know we have about 3 minutes left, so we'll just give it a minute to see if anyone has anything else they'd like to ask. We certainly appreciate everyone's time. On behalf of the Alumni Association, thank you for joining us for this series. Please fill out the survey that will be sent, and we'll be sharing some follow-up information as well. And don't hesitate to reach out.
Thanks everyone for your time.
Okay, I think we are good. Thanks so much, ladies.
You're
Thanks, Francie.
welcome. Thank you.
All right. Talk to y'all soon.
All right.
Sounds great.
Take
Thanks
care.
so much.
See you, Alexis.
Bye.
Bye.